Their origins have long been forgotten, yet everybody wears them. Trousers. They enclose your hips, butt, thighs, and knees. Forked leg dress, one piece. But who invented trousers? When and where? One might think they always existed, at least for as long as humans roamed the colder regions of this world. The invention of the trousers. The man from the ice of the Ötztal Alps should have worn trousers to keep warm 5,300 years ago. But no, under his coat he wore leggings made of goatskin, tied to a calfskin belt and a loincloth. And what did men wear in other areas of the world 5,000 to 2,000 years ago? In the kingdom of Sumer, a cloak and underneath a short skirt. In Scandinavia, a coat over a short garment. In Greece, a fringed skirt. And also, in Assyria, a skirt. 2,000 years ago, the Roman legionnaires fought in a tunic over naked legs. The Roman soldiers wore tunics, despite being aware of the existence of pants. At least 2,500 years ago, Greeks had seen the Scythians in trousers. The Persians knew of trousers from the Sarka, but the only preserved leg dresses from that time have been found in graves on the icy heights of the Altai Mountains, far to the north of the lands of the Persians or Greeks. If not for ice, salt, or being waterlogged, the quick decay of clothing and textiles in human burials will leave only bones. Our knowledge of the fashion of distant times and regions is mainly second-hand, stemming from artwork and texts. There is, however, one exceptional circumstance that has fostered the survival of ancient textiles. In Eastern Central Asia, in the Tarim Basin, the extremely dry climate has preserved garments and equipment for thousands of years.
In
2003, excavations began at the Yanghai site. What was discovered when unearthing the graves was impressive because so much organic material was preserved due to aridity. This man still had his complete outfit and his equipment beside him. He held a whip handle in his right hand, and next to his head the bridles of a horse hung from a wooden peg.
Apparently, the Tuathan man belonged, like the Altaians, Scythians, and Sarka, to the North Asian horse-riding peoples of roughly 2,500 years ago. He is dressed in a poncho, a broad and looped waist belt, boots and bands. His trousers, however, appear shockingly fashionable and modern, almost as if he just took them off after a night of partying. Low-cut crotch, narrow-cut legs, and worn-out sections. Top baggy, leg skinny. Cool. How did the ancient dressmakers create this look? Objects do not readily reveal the knowledge that their creator possessed. Reverse engineering is a strategy used by today's industries to extract information from a product. Analysts examine its structure and functionality, then draw and reproduce it as a full-scale copy. Archaeologists try to do the same with ancient products. However, these scholars are confronted with an almost insurmountable obstacle, which is unique to archaeological finds. These artifacts cannot be damaged during analysis and must be preserved complete for public display in museums. Archaeologists must approach the artifacts like a crime scene and conduct a non-destructive forensic investigation to interpret how the crafts were produced. An international team of archaeologists, fashion designers, geoscientists, chemists, and conservators are facing the challenge. Their research starts with a journey to Tuafan. Only a 5,500-kilometer beeline distance lies between Berlin and Tuafan, but the flight route takes them from Berlin to Frankfurt, from Frankfurt to Beijing, from Beijing to Urumqi, adding up to 11,000 kilometers, a distance covered in 24 hours. Travel continues by car for another 200 kilometers, from Urumqi to Tuafan, passing the eastern spurs of the Heavenly Mountains, in Chinese called Tian Shan. Tuafan is a place of extremes. Temperatures may drop to minus 28 degrees Celsius in winter and rise to 50 degrees in summer. The average precipitation is low, roughly 16 millimeters of rain per year, and the hot raindrops evaporate upon impact with the scorched ground. For over 1,000 years, people were buried in this gravel desert. Here, Chinese archaeologists discovered the Tuafan man. In 2003, we began to dig in Yanghai and numbered the graves consecutively, M1, M2, and so on. This grave here was one of the first we found.
M1, M2这样。
In the museum's laboratory, scientists together follow the course of the trouser seams, count warp and weft threads, measure lengths and widths. The information is then recorded on data sheets. Under the microscope, they see that the yarn consists of wool fibers from sheep. All archaeological research starts with the question of the age of the discovery. How old is the yarn? Or, when were the trousers tailored? Elapsed time can be measured in the lab, for example, using the radiocarbon dating method. But will the tiny sample suffice for measurement? It is really a minuscule sample. It should contain at least 1 milligram of carbon to ensure a credible age determination. Now, we need to ask our colleague first whether or not this will be enough.
Kollege fragen, ob das reicht oder nicht.
The carbon isotope dating takes about 3 months. This means waiting. The trousers were made from sheep's wool. Like all living creatures, sheep take up the radioactive carbon isotope C14 from their environment and store it in their bodies. Living organisms replace the decaying C14. The wool fibers that have been sheared off are no longer part of the animal's life cycle. The C14 isotopes start to decay and their abundance decreases over time. After about 5,700 years, only half of the isotopes are still present. Because this decay law is consistent, physicists can measure how much C14 is left in the wool and calculate when it was sheared off the sheep. Radiocarbon dating cannot provide an exact year, but the time range can be narrowed down to a 50 to 100 year margin. The dating was successful, but the results surprised the team. The Tuafan trousers were manufactured between 3,100 and 2,900 years ago. If this is true, then the trousers would be hundreds of years older than any other trousers previously known from the North Asian horse-riding peoples. To be certain, this dating must be confirmed by corroborating the date with radiocarbon dates from the poncho and boot bands. They should more or less be the same age. Indeed, they are. All of the Tuafan man's clothes are about 3,000 years old. As the shock of this discovery sets in, The team becomes aware of the fact that they are not simply working on the oldest trousers in the Tarim Basin, but they have discovered the oldest known trousers in the world. The scientists advance into an unexplored area of clothing and fashion history. The impressive antiquity was only the first discovery. Many more will follow. With these trousers, nothing is as they expected it to be.
Archaeological finds of garments normally are presented lying flat on a display table or in a showcase when shown in exhibitions. Thereby, they lose their three-dimensionality and are no longer understandable in their original form. Only fashion designers have the imagination and skills to envision clothing three-dimensionally, specifically how the designs will function on a dynamic body in motion. This is precisely what we aim to accomplish from the beginning of this project. Normally, fashion designers do not belong on an archaeological team, but when garments are found that are so complex and complete, you certainly need them as allies.
Ulrika Beck is a fashion designer, but most importantly, a specialist on the construction of clothing. She immediately recognizes that the Tuafen trousers have an entirely different design than modern ones. Only after systematic calculation and repeated revision of the measured data by test models, she succeeds in defining number, shape, and size of the parts. However, these were just calculations on paper. Whether her theoretical reconstruction actually works on the body, Ulrika had to test with a full-scale model first made from neutral nettle cloth. This was the only way to determine how the parts were actually sewn together. The most elaborate part was the crotch piece and the way it was applied.
The crotch piece is fascinating because it connects both trouser legs in a manner that allows the wearer to move in it. If you just sew up the legs, you might be able to put on the trousers, but there's no way you could walk freely. That means the crotch piece is absolutely necessary to move in them. We still have a crotch piece in our trousers today, but you don't see it anymore because of the thousands of years of construction development. Today, the crotch piece is much smaller and separated in parts which became elements of the legs. The most exciting moment was when our test person put on the model for the first time. At first sight, it was great. While sitting, the model worked better, much better than we thought. But while walking, it was worse than we anticipated. This was because there is too much fabric between the legs.
The trousers are made from 3 pieces of cloth, 2 legs from waistband to seam, and 1 crotch piece looking like a stepped cross. They were assembled in the following way. First, the legs were folded vertically so that the folds, slits, and strings were facing outwards. Each leg was closed with a seam along the inside, from the hem to the height of the crotch, to create tubes. The leg pieces were sewn together at the waist, front and back, and spread out to the sides. The folded crotch piece closed the opening completely. Along the edges, it was stitched tightly onto the leg pieces to close the one-piece leg dress. When the pant legs lie parallel, the crotch piece folds so that its actual width can't be recognized. At this point, the team could have finished. The results would have served for the final report and publication. But there was one more detail that troubled them.
There was one observation we could not explain. The construction and design researcher looked thoroughly for it, and the conservators checked everything with a magnifying glass, but none of them found traces of cutting. Those 3 parts were not cut to size. The trousers from Shanghai were only one small part of our greater research project, Silk Road Fashion. Actually, we wanted to finish this small part with the test model. But now that a number of new questions had arisen, we couldn't stop. We had to find out how it would feel if this test model became a real model with authentic material. Which properties would it have when a person wore them? And above all, is it even possible to weave those pieces into a shape and tailor trousers from them?
Und daraus eine Hose bauen.
It's getting serious now. To reproduce everything in a scientifically correct way, further specialists must join the team. First of all, somebody who can weave. Textile designer Moa Halgren is willing to experiment. On her looms, she will try to create the 3 pieces of fabric with the same size, shape, and patterns as the 3,000-year-old originals.
The key question for me is what techniques and bindings were used in this fabric, so that we know what tools we need.
Ja, ich nehme an, das werden die Risse sein.
The main weave is a twill. One zone is keeling. Both are well-known weaving techniques. No problem. The area around the knee, however, is different. Here, a meander pattern in a twining technique interrupts the twill. That is, at least, what the conservators believe. Irina Yolkina, architect, archaeologist, and textile researcher from Moscow, produces technical drawings from freehand sketches and photographs as templates for the weaver. In the meantime, Moa tries to find suitable yarn.
We examined many different types of yarn from various manufacturers. But eventually we realized that no yarn was suitable for our purpose. We needed strong single yarn. But today, they simply don't make this kind of yarn anymore. Their structure looks completely different. Single modern yarns are much weaker than the yarns back then. So in the end, we were left standing with empty hands. On this picture, you can see that industrial yarn is made from very loosely spun threads. Only by twining 2 single threads is some kind of stability obtained. As single yarns, they wouldn't work on a loom. Only through reinforcement by twining would they work. When looking at the ancient yarn, you can see that the individual threads are highly twisted, which results in greater durability. Because of that, such a yarn works well on the loom. To produce yarn, you first need raw wool. This means now we even had to procure raw wool. Originally, we couldn't imagine that we would have to go back in the construction process as far as the source of the material. So we set out in search of sheep and for shearers who could take off their winter coats. All those questions about sheep and wool quality were completely new to us. Luckily, the colleagues from the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research led us on the right path quickly.
Here we see yarn from the trousers. It consists of fine wool from a sheep. The undercoat of a sheep constitutes the actual wool that most wild sheep lack. Their coat mainly consists of the much stronger and thicker guard hair. Wool-bearing sheep descend from a wild sheep species called mouflon, which was distributed from Turkey to southern Iran about 10,000 years ago. It was domesticated in the region of modern Anatolia. The first woolly varieties of sheep are known to date to roughly 5,000 years ago, again in the Near East. This new wool-producing sheep variety then spread over all of Eurasia by 4,000 years ago. From that time period, archaeologists have found their remains in Europe and also for the first time in China. However, when we say that woolly sheep were in China around that time and provided the yarn, we shouldn't imagine them looking like our fluffy white merino sheep so popular today, but instead like sheep with more coarse wool, for example like Skudde or Pomeranian sheep breeds in Europe since medieval time. Scudder are small, frugal sheep. They are among the oldest domesticated sheep breeds and are on the red list of threatened farm animal breeds. In the animal park, Archivada, and at the Scudden farm, Brandenburg, the scientists get brown and white fleeces.
But to produce yarn from the fleeces didn't go quite as smoothly as we'd hoped. Moa calculated that we need 8 kilometers of yarn for the trousers. Who can spin 8 kilometers of yarn? Finer than 1 millimeter, yet tough enough that it will not tear on the loom. Spinning mills can do that, of course, but for them, 8 kilometers is not worth the effort of starting the machines. We then asked hobby spinstresses, but for them, 8 kilometers was too much of a labor investment. Nobody wanted the job. We didn't expect, however, that our savior was practically sitting next to us.
Dendrochronologist Uwe Heusner, who is indispensable for age determinations of wood, learned how to spin with a spinning wheel in his youth. He finally helped his colleagues out of their troubles.
The wool is just as it comes from the sheep. You can't reprocess it just as neatly as the sheep was wearing it, and above all, it is still greasy, so that it runs well. With one hand, you hold the dirty side and pull out to the clean side. Now you make, with as much skill as possible, a long and even thread. It's actually only a matter of patience. Each sheep is different and has specific qualities in its wool. Buck wool is more coarse and longer, especially among Scudder. Mother sheep have much finer and softer wool. You feel it. In the past, threads were spun harder. Especially for weaving, you need more closed threads that have a higher tear resistance and strength. Durability increases and the thread becomes tougher and more abrasion-proof.
Now, Moa begins to test the different weave types.
This is one of the first samples I wove with the yarn from Uwe. It's a twill weave, which you can recognize by the distinct diagonals that are characteristic of this type of binding. You can also see that it's very sturdy and at the same time elastic. The interesting thing is that today we also frequently make trousers with this binding, like the classical denim jeans we all wear, which are woven in twill. Those are also very sturdy and elastic.
Sehr stabil und gleichzeitig haben die eine gewisse Elastizität.
In this twill weave, the pattern repeat, the smallest element creating the pattern, consists of 4 warp and 4 weft threads. To make it, 4 header rods are used to lift 4 different groups of warp threads. By lifting the header rod, a so-called shed opens. Through this shed, the weft thread runs from one side to the other. The weft thread covers the warp threads, which are not raised, and remain below those pulled up by the header rod. At the height of the crotch, the color of the fabric changes. The weaver 3,000 years ago could have simply used a white weft thread instead of a brown. That would have been fast and easy. But she didn't. She wanted light and dark step pyramids to interlock. So she alternated the colors in killing technique. The third type of binding is much more time-consuming. It is the most important discovery of the textile production technique. Why?
This was described by the conservators as being a plain twining technique.
Plain twining was used in prehistoric Europe for making nets and bags with plant fibers. For example, Utsi had a dagger sheath made from twined lime bast.
I then tried it like this, but the result did not match the original. It can't be plain twining, but instead some kind of improved form. Looking at the original, you see that the pattern on the front side of the fabric also occurs on the reverse. And my first sample shows a completely different picture on the reverse. I've looked for examples of this technique for a long time. And finally, I found it in New Zealand, where this technique is still known. It's used for making plant fiber coats. There it's called tannico. It resembles twining, but it's much more complex than the classical plain twining. With this special technique, you can create large-scale patterned fabrics without using complicated weaving instruments.
In the tannico technique, two different colored threads are used in parallel. One thread forms the pattern. The other runs along the reverse. They do not only twist around the warp threads, but also around each other between every second warp thread. This step fixes the threads on the reverse so that they don't hang loose and the fabric becomes stable.
This patterned zone at the knee in tannico technique is special and exciting because it represents a fusion of old and new techniques. Tannico is the old slow twining technique, made using only the hands. But above and below is the new twill weave, made using the devices of the loom.
All tests confirmed. The fabric of the tuafan trousers combined 4 types of binding techniques: elastic twill, stable tannico, color change in killing, and tear-proof rep weave for the trousers waistband. The clothmaker 3,000 years ago mastered them all and strategically applied them to optimize the look and the fit of the trousers on the body. As in all forensic cases, the central question remains to be answered. Why? What motive did the tuafan dressmakers have to create trousers?
We wanted to answer the question, were the people in Tuafan really the first who had the idea to make trousers? We searched for predecessors, for finds that are older than the Turfan man, and the trousers. In Turfan itself, we couldn't find any older discoveries. The next ones that are older are the finds in Chiauja.
In the Tarim Basin and in the heart of the Taklamakan Desert lies the cemetery of Chiauja. Here, the clothing fashions from the centuries before the Tuafan man are preserved in a huge sand dune. So, is anyone in this cemetery wearing trousers?
In fact, there are no trousers in Chiauja. Instead, men and women wear skirts made of cords. They were wrapped in woolen blankets or cloaks, soft fleece caps on their heads, and short leather boots on their feet. They didn't have any other garments. The people of Chiauja could process wool, and they mastered simple weaving techniques. Besides, they were skilled at braiding techniques. Plain twining with multicolored plant fibers is visible on their pouches. The cemetery of Chiauja is a striking paradox. What we see are boat coffins in the middle of the desert. The deceased lie under turned boats on a giant sand dune. They were placed in the sand and then covered by the boats. Today, you only see sand all around them.
Feathers of water birds cling to scepters, and flattened goose quills form the teeth of wooden masks. Everything indicates a life in marshes and lakes. One coffin is different from the others. It is completely plastered with clay. This clay contains tiny plant remains, the age of which was determined to be 4,000 years ago, 1,000 years older than the Tuatha man. Microscopic pollen grains are also among the plant remains. These deposits are climatic archives from which scientists can tell the weather forecast of the past. We are all familiar with pollen. It originates from flowering plants. Pollen grains are tiny containers in which the male reproductive cells are carried by wind, insects, or birds to the female receptive organs of the same plant species. Many end up in lakes and are deposited in the sediments at the bottom. Every year in the flowering season, a new layer of pollen accumulates. Pollen grains have a very durable cell wall, so they last millions of years in the sediments. Scientists pull a sediment core out of the lake floor, extract the pollen from the samples, and determine their age. Palynologists, pollen researchers, determine which plant the pollen came from based on its shape, and therefore determine when specific plants grew in a certain region. This means, if you understand the pollen data, you know the plants of past times. If you know the plants, you can deduce the climate and local environment of that time.
In this
4,000-year-old clay sample, we did not find many pollen grains. The vegetation was not as dense as we know it in Europe. However, we could tell that 50% of the plants were from wet environments, grasses, sedges, and reed, plants that often grow on the shores of lakes and rivers. The other half were typical desert plants, like chenopods, ephedra, and artemisia. What we also found in the clay are tiny shells of sea shrimp. Pollen and sea shrimp together indicate that the sample comes from a nearby river or lake surrounded by desert. The best-known lake in this area is Lobnor, which was fed by the Tarim River and its tributaries.
Other climate archives confirm that environmental changes between 4,000 and 3,000 years ago were particularly dramatic. At first, water flows from the mountains into the basin and accumulates in lakes. Along the rivers, the ancient farmers grazed cows and sheep. They grew wheat, barley, and 2 varieties of millet, and they hunted waterfowl. Gradually, meltwater and rains decreased. The desert shoved the inhabitants of the oasis towards the mountains. They were forced to find other habitats and adapt their lifestyle to new environments. There, they likely met people coming from the west with domesticated horses. To cross wide regions with sheep, goats, and horses, still done today, requires strength. Riding makes it easier, but higher mobility has its price. It claims the health of the herders and leaves traces. Traces in the bones of riders. On skeletons of the Tuatha man's contemporaries from the western end of the Tian Shan Mountains from Kazakhstan, the paleopathologist Yulia Gretsky diagnoses mechanical overload. For example, on this thigh bone of a 1.8-meter tall man.
Here we see the attachment site of abductor muscles. This area is relatively smooth, as it should be, But here are tubercular areas and a prominent ridge. In this area, the muscles along the inner side of the thighs are attached, which are the muscles you use when riding, because you have to keep the legs close to the horse. Muscle pull causes the sites where the muscles and bone attach to become reinforced. Bone is built up as the bone reacts to permanent or short but intense pull. More pull causes the build-up of more bone material.
Strong arthritis, already at an age between 30 and 50, from the cervical vertebra to the lumbar spine, and fracture of the vertebral bodies.
This is the fifth thoracic vertebra, which is strikingly reduced in height compared to the others. We can imagine that during riding and when the rider falls off, the spine is compressed. The upper and the lower vertebrae scrunch the one in the middle. We see those cracks here, but the edges are not sharp, instead they are rounded. The body had time to repair it, meaning the man did survive this injury for a long time.
Not all of them were nomads or herders. The Tuathan Depression was a refuge in which farmers could settle down amongst a diversity of people with different economic pursuits. Here was water and space enough for gardens, houses, and temples. The most recent temples were built here in the early Middle Ages. Their remains now belonging to the World Cultural Heritage of the Silk Road. In this area, the Tuathan man lived. We know he was accustomed to riding horses because he was buried with a bridle and a whip. He had a battle axe, so he was one of the warriors who stood against predatory invaders and went to battle. His service for the community was rewarded with the invention of a protection for his body on the horse. Riding without trousers is possible, but with trousers you can more comfortably ride for longer distances and more effectively fight, determining who is victorious and who survives. And this is how the trousers were made. First, shear brown and white sheep. From the wool, spin a fine yet strong yarn. Mount brown yarn as a warp thread in a loom. Weave twill with brown weft thread, flexible and sturdy. Alternately, braid the pattern parts, especially at the knee. Impressive and stable. On the belly, change to a white color. At the transition, weave step pyramids in killing technique. Leave side slits during weaving for putting on and taking off the pants. Just add a few centimeters of rep weave as a waistband. When the cloth is removed from the loom, braid the ends of the warp threads. To finish, add cords at the side slits for closing. As a crotch piece and firm seat, weave a stepped cross. Sew the three pieces together with the same brown and white thread. Embellish the seams with plaited strings. Finished. This replica is proof. The trousers were custom made. Without cutting, there is no waste. They achieved 100% material capacity. From the onset, the textile masters did not have a two-dimensional fabric in mind, but three-dimensional trousers. They built it around the body and considered high strain at different parts. Highly durable yarn made the trousers long-lasting. In order to test how the trousers were worn together with the other garments, they have also been reproduced as close to the original as possible. The leather boots, the bands over the boot shafts, poncho and belt. Each piece another research topic, another story. When they are tested with a horse, they harmonize ideally. Mounted warriors spread the trousers across Eurasia. They were particularly popular among the steppe peoples and horse breeders in the north. Gradually, the great empires in the south adopted cavalry as a mode of battle, and with it, they took to wearing trousers. The ancient Persian Empire of the Achaemenids, Urartu, and New Assyria. Through the Scythians and Persians, trousers arrived in Greece. At the same time, the Chinese set up the first mounted armies. For 2,500 years, Europeans and Asians knew of the fork-leg dress, but they did not get accustomed to it for a long time. Some never did. Clever designs and new materials made the trousers comfortable clothing for all people and occasions. The trousers we wear to this day are reminders of the highly skilled textile and garment makers and professional horse riders of 3,000 years ago. Their story should not be forgotten. Like wheel and bread, trousers are among the great inventions that are universally usable and adaptable. To explore their origin increases our knowledge and enriches our global cultural heritage.